All right. Hey, Ryan, good to see you.
Mason, good to see you too.
Yeah. So I'm excited about today's conversation and getting into the inflection points of growing an agency. And I think today we're going to talk about some of the basics. This conversation has come out of a lot of different conversations that I've had with different people within the Webflow community. I know you're kind of new to the Webflow community, but you've been
Yeah.
working with a ton of different agencies. And, there's this kind of opportunity gap that I see where, Webflow allows us to go and do kind of like exponentially better things. And then it's like the challenge is like how to grow business acumen. So I hope kind of today's conversation can help to spur along some ideas around some of the basics. And so people can do even more awesome stuff on the web. So real quick, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. What are you doing? Like, what is Upsourced?
Yeah. Happy to do that. Yeah. So Ryan Watson, of course, I'm a partner at Upsourced. I'll tell you a little bit about Upsourced, which is, the simplest way to describe it is we're an accounting firm for creative agencies, which is a little bit of a misnomer in that, like, unlike traditional accounting firms, we really don't focus on the compliance-oriented services like audit or tax. Instead, we focus exclusively on outsourced accounting and CFO services. So, like, in other words, we provide basically services in one of two buckets. The first is we're going to help you produce the financial and non-financial data, like the accounting, but also time tracking and CRMs, the financial and non-financial data to help you make decisions. And then the second thing is we're going to join your leadership team. We're going to sit side by side with you, and we're going to help you interpret that data and make strategic decisions. That's basically what we do. So I'm a partner in there. We've been doing it for the better part of 11 years now, which is weird to say out loud, but we've got over 100 marketing agency clients all over the map in terms of geography and size. And we've got, a couple dozen employees. So the only other thing I'll say, so I'm a partner there. Prior to this, I actually was in the operating chair. So I was the CFO, COO of influencer marketing and media agency, which got to about 50 million in revenue, and we ended up selling it. So I have a lot of empathy for being on both sides of the aisle, as it were.
Yeah. That's amazing. And congratulations on your 11 years. We just turned 10, and I can't
Awesome.
believe that. Yeah, thank you.
Wow, I know.
When I was getting started, I'd come from like a design background. I didn't know anything about, like, I'd never been a project manager. I'd never been an account person. I knew what a project plan looked like.
Yeah.
I hadn't ever, like, I'd heard about this idea called P&L because basically at my last agency, if I didn't like sell enough work, then you had to fire your friends. Like that's how it was.
Intuitively, there was some relationship there, but
yeah. But once you start doing that on your own, it becomes a lot more real. And I think it can also become very scary. And so, as a new agency starting out, where do you see, like, what are some of the key financial needs and priorities, and like what should be on people's radars as they're getting going?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. And my take on this is going to be maybe counterintuitive, given that, like, first and foremost, I'm a finance guy, right? But, I'll say that I do see a lot of early agencies over-index on finances and do things like create complicated business plans or 3 or 5 year, forecasts. And, I would describe a lot of these activities as like playing business versus running the business. The reality is, especially at that incredibly early stage, like 0 to whatever, a couple 100,000 in revenue, this, Mason, like the game is just sales and service, right? Like, what am I providing? Who am I providing it for? How do I find these people? In my opinion, there aren't that many problems. Like, if you get to $1 million in revenue, there aren't that many problems that I can't help solve for you once you got there. The one problem I cannot solve for you is the fact that you ran out of money or gas and you never got there. Like, that I can't help you with. But if you can get to $1 million, that's probably the inflection point that most of our new clients start with us. And they got warts all over them. And there's, concentration risk and profitability problems or whatever. Like, we can solve those. The goal here, like, the priority would be, like, what are the things that are going to cause me a lot of risk and a lot of money if I don't take care of them? And that's it. That's the whole focus. I won't get into like a lot of the specifics because I know we're going to hit on those later, but like generally they exist in the legal and compliance realm. Like, that's where you should focus. Like, if you have partners or you've talked about giving equity to people, a napkin doesn't work. Get an operating agreement, get share agreements, take care of that, right? Like, if you're paying people, freelancers or employees, you got to make sure you're paying them the right way. And finally, like, you have to make sure that, like, you're organizing information in a way that you can pay tax and that you're actually paying tax. these kind of compliance oriented things, these can be landmines that are a little bit costly and painful to undo. As long as we take care of those things, then all the other, complicated finance oriented stuff, like even really looking at a P&L, that stuff can wait. It can wait.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And for me, like, I mean, I only learned like this idea of EBITDA, like maybe 2 years ago. I still get gross and net mixed up. Like I understand I understand the concepts, but it's just, I always have I kind of got to go in and Google that a little bit.
And even even at an agency of your size, like there's really, I mean, we really preach like, let's focus on the one thing. Like it's easy to make finance complicated. Lots of people are incentivized and well compensated to do it, but it's really not. Service business are pretty easy, right? So like we can really like carve away a bunch of that stuff. And at the end of the day, like, the profitability is measured in a couple of ways. And as long as we're doing that well, we're going to be okay. So
that makes sense. I didn't realize you had started an agency. That's pretty awesome.
Well, I wish I could take credit for starting it. I didn't.
Okay,
this is a very long story, but I will make it condensed, which is I came in at an inflection point of this agency. Actually, this was a sort of software and service company that kind of wanted to be more software, but the world really wanted them to be more service. And I came in at 3 million in revenue, realized we had to ride that down below 3 million in revenue in order for us to ride it back up. And this was, we were producing a lot of content, and it was a lot of like, third-party content. And this was as like the influencer moniker was sort of being coined. And so we were fortunate enough to see a trend and kind of lean into a thing that we were already doing by a different name. We called it like brandables, branded content, kind of leaned into that. And we were able to ride it. We paired it with media, which was a little bit unique. Most of folks were selling it in an organic way. We paired it with media. Anyways, so I joined. I helped us redefine what it was away from software into service. So maybe like a refounder, if you will. But I wasn't on the original team. But yeah. So I've been on the agency side though. Like I know what it's the game.
Yeah, that's wild. You said you had to kind of like write it down. I guess there were parts of the business that just weren't profitable or weren't where you wanted to go. I mean, like that's a tough call.
It is. I mean, yes, it is. And it's never, I mean, again, I've hired a lot of people. I've let a lot of people go. I've seen it in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, I think that was it's not uncommon. We have clients like this. I'm sure you've come into to folks like this, especially if there's like a technology element to your service business. There is definitely a pull to produce software for its own sake, right? To produce SaaS and to have that as a revenue stream. And by the way, that's not a bad strategy. In some cases, it's a good strategy, but it's not always a good strategy. And in our case, it was not a good strategy. And so we spent a lot of money to build a self-service tool when the kind of people we were selling to, they had a lot of tools. They didn't want tools. They wanted somebody to solve their problem, right? They wanted service. And so, unfortunately, we had to part ways with a lot of the sort of infrastructure and the folks who built the infrastructure that was, that was pursuing a model that it wasn't what the market needed. And it was helpful to come in with a fresh perspective and be like, it seems like we're square peg round hole here. They want this. They're telling us this in no uncertain terms. We've got to double down on this. So unfortunately, while we did have to let some folks go, and that is never like an easy thing, we were able to sort of, ride the wave back up within 12 months. And it was a positive story, but it required no outcome. Nothing is linear. Nothing is ever exclusively up and to the right. It's always, there's always little steps along the way. And sometimes you got to go backwards. So.
Yeah. I mean, we see it in our business where it's seasonal, where, we'll have big buying periods. And I think spring often, like, people are kind of waking up within their budgets, and then you're trying to get that work booked, and then kind of whatever work that we have booked by, say, like October, like that's the work that we're going to see through the end of the year. And then January, February, like those months are always wild, where, people are kind of coming back from the new year and they're like, oh, what should we do? And, we saw a huge turnover this year in our clients. We also, fortunately, had our best sales month ever in January. So it was kind of like offboarding and onboarding, and it was a wild period. But backing up a little bit, I know for today's conversation, we're sort of talking about these inflection points. We had talked about that separately, and that
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that's a challenge within, a services business is like the business is always changing. And you had even mentioned, it's like you're maybe doing one thing, and then it's the way that you're operating at maybe 0 to 300,000 is going to be different than like 300 to a million, and then a million to 3. And so I think for today, just looking at some of the basics of getting started, and I'd love to, just start from the very beginning. Like when you had mentioned around compliance, and also just randomly, it kind of reminded me of something that my dad had told me, which is like the government puts more business out of business than like any kind of like lack of customers or things along those lines, where
Do not
you can get
get
into
me
serious
on my soapbox about this.
well,
The amount of
like
disincentive-
taxes aside, but it's just like
know.
you have to make sure that like you taking on a business, it's really a liability. And I think most people just think that it's like, it's all this great profit and revenue, but like bigger projects, bigger problems. And even like kind of as you're billing more, things along those lines, like every one of those projects is really a liability until it's delivered, and maybe even 2 years after that. We won't get into totally all the details, but fundamentals, like from the very beginning, like how should people be thinking of like setting up a business? Like I get questions like, should I have a separate bank account? Like what are some of the basics there?
Well, let's hit a couple. You hit a couple keywords there that we'll jump into. The first is like the kind of what is the first thing I want to do? Should I set up a bank account? And that is actually like the first piece of advice that we give every new business, which is like, okay, if you do, we always get like, oh, should I get QuickBooks, and should I do this and that? And what I would say is the 80 for 20. The 80 for 20 is just get a separate bank account. It doesn't even have to be in your business's name. Preferable, of course, but like the 84-20 is get a separate bank account, get a debit card, and just from that point forward, if it's related to your business, use that account, like use that debit card, receive checks there, send checks out of there. Again, like should you get something like a QuickBooks or whatever? I mean, certainly I wouldn't say no, don't do it. I think it depends on your financial literacy and all that kind of stuff. But the thing that we're trying to prevent here is, again, in the early days, like, are you going to be poring over a P&L and really dissecting it and using it to make, complicated business decisions, at 50,000 in revenue or something? No, probably not, right? Like it's a pretty straightforward business. So you're not going to learn a lot there. You're going to have a compliance obligation, which is to file taxes. And that's going to be the majority of what this information is for in the very, very early days. And so what is very hard and time consuming and anxiety producing is having like, one personal account where you've like got a bunch of commingled stuff and you got to pour through it and try to pull out, the deductions that you could probably take and whatever. So like make your life easy, even if all you ever do is that. And then by the time it comes to file taxes, at least everything is in one place. It's probably not that many transactions. You can export that to a CSV, and a tax professional, even if it's somebody at H&R Block, can take that and run with it. So that is the 80 for 20 for sure. All this other stuff is good. Nice to have. It's not a have to have. It's not a have to have. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other topic you mentioned, I don't know if you want to go here now or whatever, but is like, or you use the term organization, which is like, what should I become an LLC, or if not, like what kind of business should I form? Like, do I need to do all this stuff, right? And I think that's a common question that I hear. I don't know if you hear this. This comes up to you a lot, but I hear this.
I had someone that was asking me the other day, like, oh, should I do an LLC or an S Corp, or and I'm curious, like, what are you seeing around like how to just organize the business, and why? I mean, why do this? Like, why go through and do that paperwork?
Yeah, totally. So first of all, this answer might be like a little bit tax wonky. I'm not a tax expert by any means, but like for this area, I know this quite well, and I'm going to try not to spend like a long time describing it, but I'll be as brief as I can. But like I said, it's a little tax wonky, but it's important. And I imagine a lot of people, like especially the early agency owners, like I'm just starting, or I'm in the 50 or 100 or 150,000 in revenue, may not be like incredibly familiar with these topics. So let me just give like the quick broad overview, right? So again, with regard to what entity structure should I choose, from a tax standpoint, there's basically four, right? There's a sole proprietor, a partnership, an S Corp, and a C Corp. Those are the four. Now notice, I didn't say anything about LLC, which is like the number one thing people think of, hear of, decide to do. the LLC is a tax chameleon. The IRS does not recognize the LLC. And so they say, if you become an LLC, which all of you will, you can choose how you wish to be taxed. Your choices are one of those four, right? So the first thing you're in all likelihood going to do is you're going to become an LLC. You can use LegalZoom or some other thing. You can actually just go to like your Secretary of State website. In Ohio, it's $150. It's very easy to do. You'll know all the answers to the questions. Just do that. And the biggest benefit that gives you is just like legal liability protection. But anyways, you do have to choose what to be taxed on. And this is like where the question often comes. And so you have these four choices. The C Corp, I'm not even going to talk about. There's unlikely to be anybody on this call who's ever going to be a C Corp or want to elect to be a C Corp. So now you really just have three options: sole proprietorship, partnership, and S Corp. The sole proprietorship and the partnership are basically the same thing. A sole proprietorship is a partnership of one, and a partnership is a partnership of more than one, right? So those are the same thing. So it's really just like two options, right? And so these two options, so these are what's called flow through entities or pass through entities. And what that means is these do not pay federal income tax. What happens is if they generate profit, all of the profit flows through to the owner or owners, and those owner or owners will pay taxes on their personal tax return. So like what will happen is, the agency creates $100,000 of profit. That profit will flow through on a K1. You take the K1, you slap it on your personal return. It gets added to your taxable income. You pay taxes on that. That's how it works, right? So, they're both of those types, like the sole proprietorship, partnership, and S Corp, they're both pass through. Where they are different is in this one important topic. And so when you're a business owner, you're going to pay taxes, income taxes on your profit, right? It's going to flow through to you. You're going to pay income taxes, but you're also going to pay this thing called self-employment tax. Self-employment tax is basically just FICA, right? Like, so when you're paying people, there's Social Security and Medicare. There's an employer portion. There's an employee portion. Well, guess what? When you're a business owner, you're both. So you get to pay both, which is 15%. So in the case of a sole proprietor or a partnership, $100,000 of the profit, let's say, you're just the sole owner, it's $100,000, it all flows through to you. You're going to pay income tax on the $100,000. You're also going to pay the 15% self-employment tax on the $100,000 too, right? Big bummer. S Corp, small difference. And this is where the S Corp is beneficial and why the vast majority of our clients ultimately or eventually become S Corps. And the reason is because as an S Corp, you have the ability to create a salary to say, you know what? The business did $100,000 of profit, but my salary, the work I did, was worth $60,000. So I had a salary of $60,000 and then excess profits of $40,000. And the benefit of doing that is, in the case of the S Corp, you're going to pay income taxes on that full $100,000, but you're only going to pay self-employment tax on the 60. You will not pay self-employment tax on that 40. So that 15% times $40,000, $6,000, that's savings. That is tax savings by being an S Corp, which is why at a certain profit level, pretty much everybody elects to be an S Corp because it saves you in taxes. The last thing I'll say on this is like, okay, you hear this and you're like, well, duh, I guess I'll just be an LLC. I'll elect to be an S Corp. Where's the question? Where's the conversation? Well, it is kind of a pain in the butt to be an S Corp, right? So if you're just like a one-man band or a one-woman band, the sole proprietor partnership, like you're a sole proprietor, and that's just like a schedule on your personal tax return. Like you can do that on TurboTax. If you elect to be an S Corp, now you got to get a CPA involved. You have to file a separate return. That's going to cost you a couple $1,000s. If you're paying yourself a salary, which you must do as an S Corp, you got to pay yourself a salary, which means you got to do the filings and the withholdings. You got to pay a payroll company. So it comes with costs and complexity. So what we say is be an LLC, do it day one if you want to, elect to be taxed as a sole proprietor or partnership until you are at a profit level where it makes sense. At that point, you can elect to change your taxation to S Corp, and that's about $100,000. So if you're doing $100,000 of profit or more, makes sense to be an S Corp. If not, keep it simple, just be the other. So anyway, there's my long-winded canonical explanation of how this works. But we get it all the time. And I think, again, a lot of people just really don't know how this works. So that's how it works.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know how that worked at all. And for a long time. And in fact, like we only recently switched into being an S Corp. But again, like just wanted to keep things like super simple. Cause the more complexity you add to the business all around, then like all of a sudden, like, you're worried about client deliverables, and then you've got tax liabilities and like how to be able to get this machinery going. And it's just like, keep it simple, stupid.
Sales and
So
service. That's your whole
yeah,
goal at this stage. Most of what I
yeah,
can do for you is not what you need to be focused on. Like, you got to
yeah,
be focused on sales and service. All this other stuff can come later. So again, let
yeah,
that be a message. Mason, successful agency owner, didn't bother with some of this stuff until recently. So again, like there's always
yeah,
time for that. But it's good to know. Like it's good to
yeah,
know. You hear it in conversation. It's also good to know like what is there and what you shouldn't focus on.
yeah,
Again, there's
absolutely.
this enormous incentive, or not incentive, but draw to do what I call playing business. It makes you
Yep.
feel like you're being productive. It makes you feel
Mhm.
like, yeah, I did this and I filed for this trademark protection and I did. It's like, well, that's cool, but you know what? If this thing doesn't
Yeah,
make it, does that help you? No. So let's focus on making
exactly.
this thing make it, and then we'll do all the other
Yep.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of a great idea, as well as like the idea of playing business as opposed to just like doing the business. And
Yeah.
a couple things that you had mentioned, just from my experience, like I started using Freshbooks because it was
Yeah.
kind of more accessible, and then it was just like I could do it myself, super
Made for the
basic,
end
had like a
user.
little,
Made for you.
yeah, like this little pie chart. And then eventually when I brought on someone to help with taxes, they were like, oh, we need to, things get a little bit more complicated. I wasn't doing it myself. And then QuickBooks made a lot of sense. Then QuickBooks does not make sense to me. Like FreshBooks was so cozy and just felt like a warm
Yeah.
blanket. And I had like
Totally.
a great email that they sent out every week around like, you're doing awesome. And like, here's your little like bar chart and stuff.
Yep.
And, but again, like thinking about, cause from an accounting standpoint, there's, it's like standard tools and ways to do stuff. You talked about, sales and service, getting into the service side,
Yeah.
bringing on a team,
Yeah.
like as you're getting started, like, how should people think about handling payments? Is it okay
Yeah.
to treat everyone? Like a lot of people is like kind of flying the
Yeah.
contractor flag.
Fast
What's your
and
take here?
loose.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, again, my take is, yeah, everybody is doing this. Everybody's playing. So my take is everybody's playing fast and loose with the contractor. And, if you're 100, this is not tax advice. If you get selected for audit by the IRS, you cannot come back and talk to me about it. I have
Yeah.
no liability. But like, if you're small, like you're not on anybody's radar. And so I think you can, there's shades of gray. Like the IRS has kind of intentionally not been like very, explicit about the delineation between contractor and employee. So, if it's gray, then I think it's the point you should realize is it's to your advantage to call somebody a contractor for the just simple purpose of like, well, you don't have to pay them by payroll. Like payroll creates administrative complexity and you got to get a payroll provider to do it. And then, you remember that FICA, the Social Security and Medicare, there's an employer and employee portion. You don't owe any of that for a contractor, right? So it's cheaper for you if you're doing somebody 1099. So like I definitely recommend to lean into that unless it's just egregiously obvious. The standard for what is an employee versus a contractor is really more like facts and circumstances oriented. So the language is a lot like, if you are dictating where a person works, how they're working, you're providing the materials they use to work, like they're coming into your building, they're like, if you are dictating those things, that individual is probably more likely to be an employee than a contractor. And the sort of the converse is true. If they dictate where they work, how they work, they're using their own machinery, it looks more like task oriented than they look more like a contractor. So I think early on, we're talking today about the 0 to 1 million in revenue. I think most of that whole area is probably fine. If you're just choosing between these two and both parties are open to it, I think it's fine as long as there's some gray area, to call them a contractor. And there, from a compliance standpoint, you just have to make sure you send them a 1099 if you pay them over $600. So that's the obligation there. Once they become, and we maybe talk about this later, but like once they become an employee, then you do have to pay. That is not a thing to mess around with. Like, you're going to call them an employee, get a payroll provider, We use Gusto. They're great. OnPay is another, very similar to Gusto. It's not expensive. And they'll at least help you understand what filings you have to do. And then they'll just take care of all of it for you, because there's a lot. And local jurisdictions are very punitive with their penalties if you're late on like payroll taxes. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is that like, what's your take on that, Mason? Like, did you follow a similar philosophy?
I think the line around, when you have project-based work and you're getting started and you don't have like a whole lot of visibility, looking at like, okay, I'm going to be able to bring on this person to be able to help me within this individual project. That makes a lot of sense. I think once you start to have longer term commitments and, kind of expectation on number of hours or, things along those lines, where that's where you're saying like, okay, now we're going to move over into more of a full-time capacity, but trying to do that really carefully. The other thing that I've learned recently is like, hey, we're remote, right? Once you go remote and you have employees in other states, you could potentially be held to having to do income tax filings in those states. And that was something I was like, whoa, did not expect to pay California income taxes this year, but I had to do that.
Well, and I mean, this is a topic, maybe just like schedule the webinar for this. This is a topic unto itself, but again, you're hitting on a really underappreciated topic, which is today's agency is a remote first distributed agency on a 1099 basis, whatever that doesn't really change anything, but on an employee basis, you've increased your complexity tenfold when you have an employee. Just like you said, there's labor laws. Like, so for instance, California has relatively onerous is maybe the standard, but like onerous requirements around how you treat and compensate a remote employee in California. For instance, like you are required to pay them for reasonable costs if they are, if they have to be working remotely. So you have to reimburse them for, the material, like their computer, but also maybe their internet and also maybe a percentage of their utilities. Like that's a standard that's California. And if you're a Georgia based or an Ohio based agency, you wouldn't even know that, right? Just by hiring this person in California, you got the labor laws, you got to register in their jurisdiction to pay them. And then of course, now you trip maybe an income tax thing. So it increases the complexity for sure. And the point of this isn't to like scare you, because again, there's materiality to all this. And there's like real risk versus, relative risk, but you should be aware. One thing that I will plug. So we talked about how to pay people. So I kind of mentioned like you have payroll and so Gusto is one option. And then, 1099 is the other option as you get larger. And so I'm probably talking to agencies on the very top end of this sub 1 million and then maybe beyond. An area of like payroll that is at least worth looking into is called PEOs. And so the PEOs are entities that will help you with some of the HR and filing responsibilities of paying your employees. They are more expensive, but when you have a highly distributed workforce, often the cost is worth it. So that is just a breadcrumb to throw in your back pocket and to remember when you are larger and you have a bunch of employees in different states. A PEO like JustWorks is potentially worth looking into. Anyway,
as opposed to a POE. I'm just that's my last name. That's it. So I did actually have a conversation with JustWorks. It was a hefty price tag that they were bringing to me, but I can also see it because like Gusto doesn't necessarily do that. They have kind of like hire someone in another state or whatever, but then you get kicked out into that state's form, and then you have to, then you're filing that, and we've had like the highest tier within Gusto, and again, like I love Gusto, that's what we use. And we're not ready to move into JustWorks, but I can see now after filing in like South Carolina and like California and like all of like managing all of that. And again, it's not just like, hey, like from an employer standpoint, you want to be able to offer like great place to work, things along those lines. And there's nothing wrong with kind of some like making sure that people have like machinery they need or whatever. What I've seen is just like all of the laws are different and trying to stay compliant.
Exactly.
It's been
hard
for sure.
Yeah, it's exactly.
Yeah.
So that is the benefit. It's very expensive to go with folks like that. That's not a thing that is, in the next topic when we're talking to agencies that are in like the $3 million range. I think it makes a lot of sense. But they help you with a lot of, like, you got an employee in South Carolina, but they're in Greenville and there's a school district tax, and they have a different filing frequency, and like there's a huge benefit to filing under their EIN for payroll versus your own. It just kind of simplifies that, but it's hard pill to swallow until you have the profit to make for it to make sense.
As you're thinking about like cost-effective steps to manage finances, like, what are the things to look at when revenue is maybe like, we'll just take a stab here, like under 500K?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what I wouldn't do at this phase is, really complicated budgeting and forecasting exercises, right? Like I alluded to the idea of playing business, and I think a lot of people get into this area. But at the same time, like I don't think that you should be completely finance unaware. Like, so what I would recommend, again, especially if you don't have anybody on your team helping you with this, you're doing this your own. I would be aware of like, what is your break even AGI? So, okay, threw out a couple terms. Let me just like define those really quick. So AGI is like an industry term that stands for agency gross income. And so agency gross income is basically gross revenue minus out-of-pocket costs, right? So like if you're a media agency, like the media pass-through that you buy on behalf of your clients, that's passed through, right? So that's removed. Another are freelancers, right? So like if you sell a $50,000 project, but up front you're going to have to farm out 20 or 30,000 of that, and then you'll get to keep 20 or 30,000 for yourself, right? Like your AGI is gross revenue minus that amount of money you're going to have to farm out to freelancers, equal that's yours, right? That's your AGI. That's really your revenue. Some people call it net revenue. First of all, that is a really important thing to keep track of. It feels great to talk about the headline number, this gross revenue. But if you're giving away half of it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't help you. So AGI is the number that matters. And then at that point, like then you have like, be somewhat aware of like, what are your fixed monthly operating costs? So if you're very early in starting out, it might be nothing. Like it might just be you, and you can financially sustain having no salary for some indefinite period of time, which is a great situation to find yourself in if that's true. Yep. Then you're fixed, then it's zero, right? Like then it's really just a matter of like, it's all gravy, and you can last as long as you have the wherewithal to do it. But the larger you get, the more likely it is that you don't have zero fixed monthly operating costs. You have employees, you have maybe rent, you have all sorts of things, right? So just like, what is that number? Could be whatever. Let's say it's 30,000. Okay. Well, I have a 30,000 burn or monthly obligation I have to. So my AGI number, the revenue less the things that are already spoken for, it's got to be 30,000 or more in order for me to keep playing this game, right?
Yep.
And that relationship is really important to keep top of mind. And I think that's probably, again, under $500,000. And by the way, painting with a broad brush, there's some pretty sophisticated agencies under $500,000, but you get it. Under $500,000, that's probably as complicated as I would get with my financial forecasting and budgeting. And I would focus on sales and service and just keep an eye on, like, I know that I need to do that in order for me to keep playing the game.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
That makes sense. Yeah, I'd love to, and I got some great comments here in the chat. So I just want to say hello to like Jeremy and Jack and Kulua. Obviously, we got the Upsourced team. Yes, Colleen is that who's running the chat over there? I believe RR Caroline, from Unfinished. Carolyn, sorry, John, and then. Yaya or Yannick, feeling personally attacked by the financially unaware. Yaya, you're in good company there. This is like the first time I've heard of AGI, so no lie. I've just had the column named something differently.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, it's a thing. There's some thought leaders in the space like David Baker and whatever. And I'll just be honest with you. We didn't really use that term either until like maybe a year ago. And then we realized, because we would say net revenue, we're all talking about the same thing, but like more of the sort of like agency institutes started to use that. And we're like, you know what, we're going to adopt that. Let's all make sure we're saying the same thing. So we say agency gross income, but a lot of people say net revenue. But it is, we didn't, again, even us, we didn't harp on it to the degree that we do now. And the more, we're 11 years in, but the more we do this, the more we realize we've seen how easy it is to kind of fall into the, again, not to take a left turn, but a perfect example. I mean, again, I was talking to an agency owner. It wasn't even a month ago. And this person's like, I just know I need to get 160, I'm making this number up, but 160,000 of revenue. And this is a business that relies a lot on outsourced freelancing. And I'm just like, yeah, but like 160,000, those are that amount of money, that those projects are not created equal. You could sell a $160,000 project that you can service exclusively with your team of fixed monthly operating expense, like your in-house team, or you can sell a $160,000 project that has 80,000 already spoken for. So no, you don't just need 160,000 of revenue. What you need is 120,000 of AGI. That's what you need. Yeah. So let's focus on that. And that's what we're going to measure to. It was like, oh, okay. Clouds part, sun shines. Oh, I get it. Yeah. And so anyways, that's the way to think about
it. Yeah. You mentioned kind of bigger projects. I mean, from our business, we've seen where bigger projects are less profitable, or you're actually like paying for the privilege of working on them, which is the worst possible outcome. And also like really small projects where you can do a high volume of them and make good money. It's kind of around how you're tuning the company and how you're sort of tuning the team to be able to just like service and staff, for all those different scenarios. And for me, something that I've, like just kind of coming up in the keep it simple camp. There's a lot around, like, I didn't know enough about business to play business. And, like I would just keep a spreadsheet. I used numbers. I used Apple numbers because I could like current and it looked pretty. So anyone out there that's more design focused and you want to have something that doesn't look like Excel or even Google Sheets, because Google Sheets, like they both like, I just want to be able to like have my tables looking just right,
Totally. I agree.
I would just track like basically money out and money in, like what are the invoices that I'm sending in like 2 different tabs, and keep that on a monthly basis. And it was very straightforward. It also gave me, I think, a really good sense of like how the company was working. And I think there's a lot of benefit of, a little bit of DIY and then find, some help when you need it. But what do you say, like, that's all great and good. What are the common pitfalls that you see of people doing it themselves?
Well, I mean, I guess, look, there's probably 2 camps of this, right? One camp kind of relates to some of the things I mentioned earlier, which is like, do not do any of the legal and compliance stuff yourself. Like, again, there just aren't that many things that you can't undo. But like, if you didn't create an operating agreement with an early partner who, now you have this like napkin agreement, and they now have like, what they believe to be fully vested 50% shares. They've exited the picture. Now you've created this very valuable agency. Oh my gosh. Like, even if they don't have an incredibly rock solid legal claim, like, good luck selling that thing to somebody else if that's your desire. Like, nobody's going to touch that. And so, I mean, a thing that I can tell you that I learned going through the M&A process myself is like, I thought they were going to really beat me up on the finances, and I'm a finance person. Like, I'm ready for this. We got it. But like, really what they care about is the legal and employment. That's the stuff that matters the most. That is the stuff that can kill a deal. And it looks like, again, so this is a small thing, like, if you're going to work with freelancers, in addition to making sure you're paying them right and you're calling them the right thing, and you send them a 1099, like, get a contractor agreement. Go to whatever, like Chat GPT can create one. I've been having it create legal documents for me lately, and they're surprisingly good. Anyways, I won't say that.
This is not legal advice. Do not
exactly not legal advice, but do whatever you got to do. Get something decent.
Please consult.
Like like IP assignments and non-solicited things like that. Like, these things really matter. And it's hard to go back in time and fix these. So like, it's just, again, having a cost-effective lawyer who can help you just kind of see, like, here's the 3 or 4 things, like, just don't mess up right now. That really matters. So again, like, doing those things, I think are really helpful. And then look, honestly, your point about like, hey, I'm getting in there and I'm DIYing it, and I'm not a spreadsheet guy, and I'm just trying to map out my business in a way that is intuitive to me. That is, man, that's great. Like, that's what I would have you do, because you could pay, and if you're at 500,000 or below, like, you could pay somebody like us to come in, and I would tell you, don't do that. It's not a great use of your money. And also, like, there is some level of just kind of like getting exposure to this piece of the business before you have somebody come and hold your hand while you do it. That is really helpful. Like, there's some element of one of the people in here said Ryan just cut my revenue in half with one statement, but that reminded of, hey, that was funny. But B, like, that reminded me that so much of this area is like, it's sales and service, and like, what's my model going to be? Like, okay, I'm not generating an enormous amount of profit right now, but what is my, like, fast forward to a million in revenue or whatever it is, like, what is it that I'm building here, right? Like, am I going to be the kind of agency that is predominantly, freelance heavy, right? Like, so my gross revenue and my AGI are going to have a pretty big disparity, but then after that, I'm a really lean operating business, right? So my gross margin's very high, but maybe the AGI is lower, but I'm more profitable, versus like, no, I'm going to hire a bunch of people in-house. And so I'm going to have to think very carefully about, if I'm making websites, eventually I might decide that I need in-house design, I need in-house development, I need strategy and copy, and these are going to be W-2 employees. And now I'm going to have to really think about, like, okay, at $1 million in revenue, what kind of utilization of those individuals does that look like? And how much money can I make? And how much revenue do I need to make in order for those people to be utilized? And some of that is like, even if I've thrown out terms that are not clear to you, just the idea of like, how would this all fit together? Let me just kind of experiment with that. I think that can be a very helpful exercise in just kind of like figuring out the DNA of like, what am I trying to build? How do I want it to work? So anyways, I think, there are very few like budgeting and modeling. I mean, outside of just like running out of money and not realizing that you did it, that's a problem. Other than that, which again, as long as you have like a pretty clear idea of what your monthly obligations are and how much AGI you need to pull in, or even simpler, how much do you need to collect from your outstanding invoices? As long as you know that, I think, you can mess around and kind of like intuit your way through the finances, or a lot of the finances, until you get to like the $500,000 range. I think totally good. Again, assuming you bring in a lawyer and you bring in somebody to do your taxes. Do those two things. Yep. I think you're fine.
Yep. Yeah. We have in-house counsel, which I feel very blessed about.
Nice. That's cool. That's great. Yeah. How long have you had
that? Since day one.
Really?
I'm married. My wife is a lawyer, so she.
Okay, that's what I was gonna say. What is the secret here? I mean, we didn't have in-house counsel, in my last agency, and I was thinking about this on the run the other day. Like, there was one hire I would have made that I never did. It would have been counsel, because at a certain level, again, having gone through and losing full nights of sleep over things I did in MSAs that I should not have done. And also just the amount of money we paid at $700 an hour, like, it would have made more sense. Should have done it. Yeah. It's not something for this audience, but it at some point makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's like a whole other conversation, but it's definitely like, again, as you start to evolve and things along those lines, the MSA process, even just like appearing competent in those negotiations. If you're coming into a negotiation and like they have a lawyer on their side and you're just like either signing it blind or trying to do it yourself, like, that's one of those areas where it can go really bad and you just won't have any leverage, or you'll be taking on a whole lot of liability.
Totally.
But, yeah. I also want to just
all I'll say on this that topic is just like finance, where it's like, oh my gosh, you don't know what you don't know, so it seems overwhelming. Yep. Somebody like me can tell you like, okay, I get it, but there's probably just 3 things that you really need to worry about, and then just don't worry about any of the other things. A good lawyer can do the same for you, right? Like, it's not, there's a lot of things around the edges that when you're big enough, they matter, but there are a few things that you can do early on that are the 80 for 20. And that's the whole thing. You're just trying to 80 for 20 as much as you
Yep.
can and exist. Yeah.
100%. Just like every day is a gift, being able to kind of like do this work.
That's
And
right.
from the MSA standpoint, I think if there is like
Yeah.
one thing or like 2 points on there, it's capital liability. So we've always capped liability at the project price, and then
Yep.
jurisdiction and law. So
Yeah.
those are our non-starters. Like we can negotiate around a whole lot of other things, like payment terms and all that other sort of stuff. But we have those two things. That's like, by the way, no carve outs in your limitation of liability. We have lost projects because of that clause. However, I sleep great. And
Yeah,
so there's a
totally.
lot of stuff where they'll be like, except for, section 6 and whatever. And basically what it's doing is it's like defanging your limitation of liability. So it's like you feel like you have a limitation of liability, but in the reality, you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got another 12 minutes. I'd love to get into a question here from Amanda, and then we might have to have a part 2 of this, and maybe like a 1.5
There
kind
we
of
go.
episode.
Yeah, that
here,
sounds great.
and then,
Yeah. After
so,
$500,000, I think a lot of meat there that we could get into today, but let's just save it.
Yeah, I think that because I mean we can start to get into some stuff like forecasting and budgeting and growth, and really what I'd also love to do, and I got some questions here as well. They were sent over Slack, like Jack had sent one over, and I'd love to get into like a little. I'd love to get kind of like a more kind of a question and answer thing. But Amanda has at some point, can you come back to the staff part and part of staff of service? What tips do you have determining what to hire versus contract and when? Full-time, revenue ballparks, that type of thing.
Oof. This is a hard question to answer, Amanda. I'm going to take a quick crack, and then I mean the big chunk of what I'm going to say is it depends. And Mason, you should answer this too because you're going to have maybe a different perspective, but you've lived it as well. Look, I keep saying like sales and service, like the big challenge especially under $500,000 is like there's no great answer, right? Like you don't generate enough revenue to hire FTEs for many, or in some cases, any of the things that you're doing, like right away, right out of the gate. Like you know, unless you have some personal wealth or some other money, like you're not going to be able to hire people if you don't have revenue to support them. And so you're going to have to, your goal early on is to make as many of your fixed costs variable costs. So you are probably going to have to contract out some of that early on. The downside of like contracting is, unless you have like close relationships that are freelancers, which is really what you want to lean into. If you're just kind of going out into the abyss, the market, as it were, there's a lot of risk there, right? We have a number of clients who have played this, who have relied heavily on freelancers, and then they win some work, and that freelancer actually gets pulled away to another project. It's going to pay them more money, and now they're like ready to kick off, and they can't do it. So that's not a great answer, right? I mean, it's that's a tough one. And then, of course, like you may just be at a point where you physically cannot afford to do it. And so I think that it has a lot more to do with like, look, your core competency. What are you as an agency? Like, what are some agencies are what I would call multidisciplinary. Like you've got design, you've got development, you might have copy. That's a lot to manage. Others might just be pure development, for instance. And that's like, it's just single disciplinary. Okay, well, that's actually easier to start to bring in full-time people quicker because you're really just kind of working on one type of person to get and keep utilized. You'll read there are like rules of thumb out there, like revenue per FTE is a thing that larger agencies measure, and like 150 to 200,000 per FTE is kind of one of the ranges that people like to be in. But for me, I just go back to my job is to generate more revenue than my fixed monthly obligation, more AGI than my fixed monthly obligation. So if I have a mission critical service and I can pay for it as a W-2 with my AGI, then I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring it in-house. And if I can't, or it's not mission critical, I'm not going to. So I don't know. It's not a clean answer. This is the challenge. This is the service part of the sales and service that makes getting off the ground so hard.
Yeah. It's, I've always felt like it's this messy middle. Where it's like you're bigger than just an individual provider, but you're smaller than, like an established, agency. And you may look like an established agency from the outside. You've got a beautiful website, beautiful work, and really like a strong talent pool of people that you're working with. But just like, it's like at, that 2 to 3 to 5 people, what does that start to look like? From my perspective, what I did was, I think in this order, sales and service, right? And another thing that I've been told is like sales cures a lot of ills. So if you're feeling like these different pressure points, like those sales will help that a whole lot. Now you just have to get into the service part, which is like it's that other part where you're saying like, oh, well, that person might not be here, or like this is a core competency, or like having that consistency of work. And then the responsibility of now being, an employer and that's a huge responsibility, and it's
a big job. It takes time.
It's a huge job. And so I tried to have, I think it was like 4 to 6 months worth of like that person's salary on hand, so that like if things went bad, I just wanted to know like, okay, and still effectively do this, try to have like a buffer so that I knew that I could always make payroll, I could always pay the team, and then I could pay myself. Actually, for me, like I think I bounced checks for myself. I never bounced checks for anyone on the team, but I bounced checks for myself for probably the first 2 years. And it was like my credit took a huge hit. I do not advise this. There is no glory in this. It is just, I think the realities of like trying to go in and like pay something that a friend of mine, Bob Morris, had told me is like, pay the team first and then pay yourself. And so I tried to go for it.
My wife and I lived with our partner, or my business partner. Like I always say we lived on the couch. It's not true. We lived in a spare bedroom, but the couch is a sexier story. But like I learned that he was expecting a baby before he did, because I was in their house, right? And it was like, we don't have like, that's, like, again, I don't know. I don't mean to like glorify or whatever, but like the point is it's tough. Sacrifices happen. And it's the success or failure. Like if you're $1 million business, like we can fix, again, pretty much all of your staffing problems, your margin problems, your utilization problems, whatever. Like we can fix that stuff. It's sales. Get there first, then we'll fix it.
Speaking of sales, we have this question from Content Nest. And so any tips, and this is kind of outside of just like the, but any tips or stories about white labeling, both for and from agencies? And so for you, again, like you have this great perspective. What within the portfolio of agencies that you work with, how do you see this working? What's your opinion here?
I'll say I don't have a lot of experience with this. I mean, I've seen it. It happens in the smaller agency. I mean, we get really involved at a larger size, so like $500,000, 2 million, or I'm sorry, 1.5, 2 million. That's like a sweet spot of size. So, again, I don't see this happening a frequent amount. So you probably have more exposure to this. The only point of view that I would have, which is, I've seen this in versions of this. And again, I'm relatively supportive of all of the ways to get to a size where we can solve our problems. Right. And so like, I just feel like if you have a platform, it's very hard to solve a lot of problems when like you don't have an agency that makes enough money for you to focus on it 40 hours a week. Right. Like, so if you got a platform that's generating some revenue and profit, however you did it, then like we could probably do just about whatever we want. So if that's a strategy to get there, that's fine with me, but I don't have a strong opinion. I don't know. What do you think, Mason?
Okay.
What's your
so my actually the thesis when I was getting going was, so I'd been at another agency before EA, and we had about 20 to 30% of the work that we would outsource. And, that was a good buffer for us so that, we could take on bigger projects and flex and have kind of a core of the team. And I thought, I was like, oh, well, I just need to be the group that goes in and takes on like that. I just need to hop around and like take on that 20 to 30% from other people. And what I found was I was able to do that some. And there's a huge benefit in being able to learn from those other groups. So you're able to kind of almost like jump in, shadow with them a bit, and then jump out. You can see like, oh, wow, like what's their culture like? What are the systems that they're using? Like, how are they organizing project management? Like all of these things are just so wildly valuable. what I ended up seeing though is that it's one thing to do that as kind of a sole proprietor. It's another thing, or kind of like as an individual contributor, it's another thing as an agency, because what you're trying to do as an agency is really it's prove a thesis more than anything that's about a number of people. And it's very difficult to prove a thesis when the way that your thesis is like how you're trying to work, right? So it's like, this is the perspective, this is the process around how we bring work to life. But when you're jumping into another agency, what you're really doing is like you're adopting their thesis, and it can feel like you're just getting kind of swung around. So it was like we would experience like their dysfunction, and we would experience like, their inefficiencies, or like whatever it might be. Like even if we had a lot of that stuff kind of cabined off for how we work, and there's some of that as well as like within, when you're working with a client. But I've just seen it less. Like I've seen like if I have direct access to the individual client, then I'll be able to influence that conversation more, or set the expectations, or like whatever that is, as opposed to being like one step removed. So net there, I would say that it was a great way to kind of get started, something that we absolutely did in the beginning. And then, it was less than I thought it would be. But then it was something that it allowed us to break off, and then kind of build relationships in other places. The other thing I would say, just last point from a legal standpoint, is watch out from non-competes, because a lot of times if you work with another agency, they can have a non-compete that then limits you for the types of clients that you would want to be able to work with. In Atlanta, I mean, there's some great agencies, and so you could go and like sign a non-compete with one agency that all of a sudden blocks you potentially. Now the enforceability of that's a different story, but that could block you, or they'd be reasonable kind of it's a reasonable headache you have to worry about.
I think that's great. I agree with all that.
So well, cool. Well, I mean, I think we're just about here at time, and Ryan, this has been just awesome conversation. I've learned a good bit, and I'm going to go in and put AGI on my spreadsheet.
Good. Do that.
I know. And I'd love for, just, there's some great comments here, and just on Twitter, I would say, one, follow Upsourced, follow Ryan, really incredible group. So much that I think like you guys have this unbelievable perspective of like, I mean, again, working with 100 different agencies, like you're going to see it kind of skinned in like 1,000 different ways, like all of the different variables that come through in there. And next time we can get in, address more of those questions, get into kind of forecasting, budgeting, thinking about growth, resources, just like, all that sort of stuff. And so I guess, is there anything else you want to kind of mention before we head out?
No, you did a great job for us. I really appreciate that. I'm excited for part 2. Let's do it. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. You can find us at upsourcedaccounting.com. We put out some content on YouTube, so at Upsourced. This is fun, man. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. And also, like, we're not trying to sell a course here. Like, there's no, like, I just think that there's a ton of value that you're able to bring to the Webflow community. And we'll go in and get kind of some sound bites cut up into, some shorts, and just continue this conversation.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Awesome.